Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. This is episode number 274. I'm your host, Eric Worrell. We're going to be doing an In the News segment. We're going to be talking about some new legislation in Illinois protecting immigrants from landlords. We're going to be talking about an update on what's happening in New York City because there's a lot of rent control laws that have gone in place there and the ways that landlords are fighting back and kind of finding creative ways to get around the new rent rules. And depending on your sense of humor, either a funny or sad story out of New York City about landlords that are dividing apartments into micro rooms. We'll get to that right after this.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
I don't know, maybe I just have a bad sense of humor, but this article from NBCNewYork.com, the title is NYC Landlords Busted for Dividing Apartments into Micro Rooms. It was just published on August 20th, and it said that the average New Yorker's small apartment is nothing compared to these illegal micro apartments on the Lower East Side. It should be illegal. I like that word. It's a lot better than illegal. The Department of Buildings said that the landlords of 165 Henry Street subdivided an apartment on the first floor and another on the third floor into at least 18 tiny rooms without a permit. So the crazy part about this is the way that they did it. They said that the building department spokesman, Andrew Radonsky, told the New York Post that the units had ceilings that are 4.5 feet tall. The apartments were divided horizontally, the report said, which is insane. And I'm surprised they had the stones to do this on the first floor. But it said that every New Yorker deserves a safe and legal place to live, which is why we're committed to routing out dangerous fire traps and ordering the landlords to make these apartments safe. Tenants living in truncated windowless dwelling units like this possesses an extreme hazard to their safety as well as the safety of their neighbors and first responders, he said. Officials placed a stop work order on the building as well as a partial order to vacate after the fire department reported illegal occupancy. At least 11 quality of life violations were issued against one landlord, Zhu Pingni, on August 14th, according to the DOB. The tenants are getting help from the Red Cross. Not a funny story as far as tenants having their life in jeopardy if there's a fire or something like that, but it does kind of remind you a little bit of that Seinfeld episode where Kramer has a bunch of tenants living inside of dresser drawers, where it's just so ridiculous that a landlord cut a apartment in half horizontally. Like, who even thought about that and was like, you know what? 7-foot ceilings are way too much. Maybe they were 9 foot because it said that they were 4.5 based on my incredible math skills. But just imagine opening the door and it's almost like some kid, went crazy with Legos and just cut the apartment in half. And I don't know, I don't know if I ever actually saw the movie. I think I might have saw some of it, John Malkovich's movie where he gets off the elevator at the 4.5 floor or whatever. Maybe it's like that when you go up to the third floor. But that's pretty crazy. And these are the type of stories that you hear where, if you're pro landlord and you feel like you're just getting so much stuff thrown at you and there's so much pro tenant stuff out there, it's because of stories like this. Like, these type of stories make headlines because they're so ridiculous. But I guess at the same time, there's people living there too who are choosing to live there, or at least maybe it did say that there was tenants already there. And that kind of speaks to the fact that there's just an affordability crisis as well, because these people were renting out these micro apartments for $600 a piece. I wish they would give an actual square footage, but I guess that's kind of a little bit skewed, because do you cut the square footage in half if it's only 4.5 square foot ceiling? If you got a 10 by 10 room, but there's a difference between a 10 by 10 room that's 100 square feet with 8-foot ceilings versus one that's 4 foot. It's hard to say that that's still a 100 square foot room, but I have a feeling that the person who probably wrote the rental listings probably was lacking some morals when they wrote it up, and they're like, no, it's still it's a 10 by 10 square foot, 100 square foot room. You're good. Oh, by the way, you're just gonna have to duck a little bit. As a 6'5" dude, I don't think I would live in that place. But that's another story. We're going to read a quick story here coming out of Illinois. This one comes from illinois.edu, And it says this was published on August 21st by Sam Dunklau. It says that immigrant tenants can sue Illinois landlords under new state law. So it says that immigrants to Illinois are able to sue their landlords if they are evicted because of their citizenship status. It's now illegal for a landlord to hang citizenship over a tenant's head as a way to threaten or discriminate against them. The new state law comes as fears of ICE raids and deportation have gripped immigrant communities nationwide, fears which some landlords are reportedly taking advantage of. Said that the Trump administration also proposed new rules on Wednesday that would allow immigration officials to indefinitely detain migrant families. But the federal government cannot let for-profit contractors fulfill that purpose in Illinois. The state banned those kind of immigration detention centers from operating within the state earlier this summer. And the governor signed the Illinois Immigrant Tenant Protection Act, makes it the second state after California to enact such a law. He said that we're stronger when we offer all of our residents the opportunity to improve their lives and the lives of their children. So this is another interesting case of where there may be a federal law or regulation, but then a state law comes out that supersedes it. And I don't remember which podcast it was, but we had talked about how at least in New York State, they were worried about immigrants not being able to live in the state because dairy farms were so reliant on immigrants. So there is kind of this, it's easy to just say, like, for maybe one side to say, oh, get the immigrants out of here, get the illegals out of here. But for a dairy farmer who relies on that population to run their farm at a profit, they obviously don't want to see them go. So it's interesting seeing all the fallout that can come from this. And again, a really good reminder to check your state laws. Make sure you're up to date on your state laws, as in this case, Illinois has just changed theirs. So that'll lead us to our last story here. It came from therealdeal.com. And it is by Georgia Cromray and Catherine Brenzel. I swear, like, there's never an author who their name is just George Smith. It's always a little bit weird. I guess those ones weren't that bad. The title here is Creative Ways New York City Landlords Are Getting Around the New Rent Rules. I know this is a recurring theme on the podcast, but basically when government steps in and, creates new rent laws or regulations, there's always going to be a fallout. We've talked about this before in, I believe it was actually Vancouver, Canada. They started to tax mansions or vacant properties because they were tired of seeing all these vacant properties. So these people ended up taking these mansions. It was this like luxury mansion tax, and they ended up renting them out to college kids. So now these people that were upset because there were these vacant properties next to them are now dealing with the fact that there's like essentially a frat house next to them living in this ridiculously nice mansion. So you might have one intention of being like, we want the property owner to keep up on the property and make sure it's not getting dilapidated. And then that luxury mansion tax ends up just backfiring. And suddenly you have a fraternity in the neighborhood, and nobody wants a fraternity in their gated neighborhood. I know that's some real problems. That's some real world problems that people are dealing with. I can't imagine the suffering that you have when you wait for your gate to come up, and then you see somebody who's half your age coming out of there in their, 2007 Nissan, and you're just really upset that you had to look at that person. But here are the 5 takeaways the 5 ways that landlords are responding to the new rent laws in New York City. I should say New York in general. Number 1 is Frankenstein apartments, i.e. combining 2 vacant rent-stabilized units to set first rent. So we just talked about, at first when I read Frankenstein apartments, I thought they were talking about cutting the apartments in half like the previous story with the micro apartments. But no, they're talking about how the new rent law was signed that landlords would combine 2 vacant rent-stabilized apartments to set a new first rent. And in cases where the initial rate exceeded a certain threshold, most recently $2,775, the unit would be deregulated. So under the new rules, which no longer permits such deregulation, some landlords are still opting to combine units to secure this one-time rent bump. So basically, a landlord has a property open up and they go, you know what, I can knock down the wall, and when the property next door opens up, we can create a new larger unit, which allows us to get around the rent stabilization of those 2 apartments by creating essentially a new apartment at a much higher rent. I was saying that, though, for landlords, it's like requiring the stars to align to have 2 apartments open up next to each other at the same time. But in some senses, they are actually offering people to move to a different apartment. They're paying them to move to a different apartment in the building because then that allows them to do this. So that is one way that they're trying to get around it. Another issue that they're having is re-identifying public eviction data. So a provision in the new law borrows the sale of eviction data to private firms, formerly known as the tenant blacklist. But nothing prevents firms from using public eviction data, which is anonymized. I'll chalk it up to one of those words I'll probably say wrong throughout this podcast. The workaround. It'll be computationally trivial to de-anonymize eviction data, especially in small buildings. Some data privacy practices depend on k-anonymity, whereby in order to protect the identities of the people in sensitive data sets, a hopefully high number of records cannot be disambiguated. I don't know why I chose this particular article to read to you on the podcast, but I will give you the rundown because there's way too many, $6 words in here. Basically, what they're doing is by kind of a process of elimination, you can figure out who that person is. And the example that they give here is that you can look at the records and it says, all right, your name might be left off the data set, but there's enough people in your zip code with a dog named Max who voted for Dennis Kucinich and are Amazon Prime members to throw identity thieves off. But that principle has its limitations, and that was laid to bear in 1997 after a Massachusetts governor's hospitalization was discovered when researchers published an anonymized. Gosh, I'm the worst. Insurance data set. Governor William Weld's identity was discovered by combining their data set with publicly available voter registration and demographic data. So it says that in New York City, tenant advocates say that landlords may be planning to pull off the same sort of feat with publicly available eviction data. So basically, they find this publicly available eviction data, and then they're just kind of scrubbing it against another data set to figure out, you know what, Jane Doe that just applied here, I know that you were evicted at some point. So, sorry, that one's a little bit of a mouthful, but we're going to move on. The third way is that they're upping the requirements to get around the tenant blacklist. And I have seen this happen quite a bit. Instead of denying an application based on a prior eviction, which is no longer allowed, some landlords are simply upping the other requirements in order to tick a different box. New Jersey-based landlord Daniel Stein, who just bought a Rochester multifamily complex, called the new rules around eviction data absolutely ridiculous. Now, if they're talking about Rochester, New York, that's actually just about an hour from where we record these podcasts. But there are ways to get around it. He said, we have very strict income and credit requirements when looking at a tenant's application. If they've been evicted 2 to 3 times in the last year, as long as they're not meeting the other requirements, we can get rid of them that way. This is one of the deterrents that a lot of people bring up of why rent regulation and these really strict and laws that are pro-tenant can have these negative effects. And this is it right here, what this guy is describing. Is okay, I can't look at eviction data anymore. Well, instead of asking for a 650 credit score, I'm now going to ask for 720 credit score. Is it going to make it harder to find a tenant? Absolutely. But the person who's been evicted the last couple of years, probably unlikely that they have kept a good credit history as well. They probably got a few debtors. They're probably not going to get through with a 720 credit score. So there are ways that you can do that, or maybe it's just stricter income, requirements. Maybe you have to make 4x of the monthly rent instead of 3x or something like that. But this is within the legal rights of the landlord to do. I am surprised, though, when I see landlords who will put their name to this saying, here's what I'm doing. But that's neither here nor there, whatever that saying means. All right, number 4. This one's one of those kind of technicality loopholes, but it's collecting application fees. According to the new law, landlord, lessor, sublessor, or grantor can only charge up to $20 to conduct a background check. But real estate attorneys say that leaves the door open for brokers and managers. Attorney Jeffrey Schwartz argues that since the law does not specifically mention managing agents, they can collect application fees for handling the sale and leases of cooperative apartments. So the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 specifies that a co-op corporation may not charge an application processing fee in connection with a new tenancy, he said in a statement. But this section of the law does not specifically mention managing agents as other sections of the act do. So according to the city assembly members Linda Rosenhall and Harvey Epstein plan to introduce legislation that would impose hefty fines on landlords and others who act on their behalf if they violate the application fee rules. But it's looking like if you're a property manager or a leasing agent, that perhaps those application fee rules do not apply to you. And this is where, they don't really knock it out of the park the first time around when they introduce new legislation. And then there's loopholes like this that happen because, somebody who is relying on that money to, run leasing, they're going to think twice about ways that they can still get that money. I mean, that's just natural. That's human, that's just human nature in some ways. So, all right, number 5 is closing the door on rent-regulated apartments. This one, I'll admit, it just seems kind of crazy to me, but it said with limited means for increasing rents on stabilized apartments, some landlords say they are simply closing vacant apartments and hoping for the rules to change. Last month, the Rent Stabilization Association and Community Housing Improvement Program filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the new rent law, alleging that it represented the legal taking of private property and violated due process rights. I think I said all those words correctly. So Bob Knackle said some of his clients are prepared to keep apartments closed off for 10 to 15 years to see if the law changes. I'm just not believing him on that one. I don't know how many landlords are going to hold out and not collect rent for 10 to 15 years. That's kind of, biting off your nose to spite your face kind of situation. That seems crazy. Unless I'm completely ignorant and these apartments are being rent controlled at $100 a month and they're worth, $4,000. I could maybe see that, but I don't see a landlord doing this for more than 6 months to a year when they're like, okay, this is crazy. That just seems kind of like a hollow threat in my opinion. But it said if your last rent from a stabilized tenant was significantly under market and you get possession of that unit somehow, you're giving essentially a life estate to the new tenant. So I think the new calculus is that rather than give a life estate to a tenant at a rent well below market, keep the unit vacant and hope that at some point in the not too distant future, either the litigation over the constitutionality of the law prevails, or we get some new laws that are more rational and motivate the private sector to invest in the housing stock. That's an interesting one. Like I said, I don't think anybody's going to sit there and just, take a L on an apartment for 10 to 15 years. That's gonna hurt to just take a zero on that. But I could see somebody, if they think something's gonna happen in the near future, doing that because you get that next tenant in, and all of a sudden you're losing 30% of what you should be getting on that apartment, and they're locked into some crazy low rent for a long time. And I'm sure a lot of these tenants too. They know, a tenant knows that they've got a sweet deal, and they're going to make it so they can stay there as long as they can. So. I thought that was a pretty interesting article, though, again, highlighting the fact that there's always going to be, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So be aware of that when you're making new laws and regulations. So the last one that I'm going to leave you with, just because we've got a little bit of time here, interesting article. I'm just going to link to it. It's from Medium. If you're into software, this guy is clearly a nerd, but he's saying that software was eating the world. Now landlords are eating everything. Just a really quick paragraph I wanted to read. This guy said that, this is talking about San Francisco, but in 2011, Mark Anderson wrote, software is eating the world. The average seed round, so seed investing from venture capitalists, was $500,000, and the median rent in San Francisco, just in 2011, was $2,600. At the end of 2018, seed rounds were up to $2.1 million, so more than 4x, and the median rent is $3,650. So it's talking that about per employee, that's an extra $1,050, and that's, post-tax dollars per month sent directly to landlords. For a 4-person startup, the yearly burn rate increased by roughly $73,000 pre-tax just in rent. If the seed round should last 4 years, that means an extra $292,000 in pre-tax expenses. So it's saying that money is being funneled directly to landlords instead of growing the company or other productive activity. Yeah, okay. I see where this guy's coming from because he's probably a software engineer. But it's just interesting when you hear things because the tech world is getting blamed in that area of the world for the increased price and rents. But it makes a lot of sense when you can say that the average seed round of investing for tech went from $500,000 to $2.1 million in 4 years. 7 years. Still, that's crazy. That's a pretty big bump that, investors are just investing big time in tech. So, if you were a landlord who happened to have a property in San Francisco, you probably love it. If you live in San Francisco and you're a teacher or somebody who's just had a job there and now can't afford to live, you don't. I know, I don't know if I mentioned it before on the podcast. I went to San Francisco earlier in the year, and my Uber driver, he owns like a $1.5 million house. And he was saying he's lived there for like 30 years, and that's how long he's owned it. And he goes, yeah, it's kind of wild. He's like, I'm driving Uber because, I didn't have a great job, but it's just weird that he has a $1.5 million valued house. But if he wants to stay in that area, he's like, I can't afford to move anywhere else. So he could sell it and obviously move to, somewhere with a low cost of living. But it's really interesting to see because that's so foreign in Buffalo, where I'm from, where, property values just kind of raise consistently, but not super aggressively. And even if they do, it's like in the case of me selling my rental property, it went from $114,000 to maybe $250,000 in the course of 10 years. We're not talking about properties going up like 4 or 5x. Yeah, it's an interesting world out there. So it'll be interesting to see what it looks like in another 10 years as well. All right, guys, that concludes this week's episode of In the News on the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. I always appreciate you guys listening. If you come across any recent news stories, you want to share them, feel free to hit me up in the Facebook group at the Rent Prep for Landlords Facebook group. All right, guys, until next week, have a great week and take care.